Okay, everyone. So, in the name of the German Society, I'm incredibly excited to welcome all of you to today's panel on the role of startups in tackling climate change between business opportunity and existential threat. As the German symposium has progressed throughout the past weeks, we have seen now a variety of actors from the government to large corporates talk about the threat of climate change and their role in mitigating its consequences. Today, we'd like to introduce another really important player in this fight, and that is startups. Let me introduce to you very briefly the founders on our panel. So I would quickly like to start with Alex. She is the founder and CCO of Planetly, a climate tech company fighting to make the business world climate neutral. She previously successfully founded Outfittery and remains active there as a board member. Next up, we have Ferry Heilemann. He is a serial entrepreneur who sold his company Daily Deal not only once, but actually twice previously. He is now active as the founder and CEO of Forto, a supply chain technology company, which was previously known as FreightUp. And he also invests as a venture partner at Earlybird. Lastly, we have Daniel Metzler, who as the founder and CEO of ESA Aerospace is working on sustainable launch vehicles to provide cost-effective access to space. He has raised over 90 million in one of Europe's largest space tech funding rounds so far. Then we have, as the chair of our meeting today, Christian Karps. He is pursuing his PhD in operations management at the Wharton School with a research focus on optimal renewable energy generation and storage investment. He has collaborated with large corporates such as AWS and smaller startups such as Kraftblock in the past on renewable energy projects. So before we start, I would quickly like to tell all participants, please contribute your questions in the Q&A. Tell us your name and your background. And with this, I would like to hand over to Christian Karps the conversation.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Lovis. Excited as well to host the panel, moderate it a little bit. And just in order to frame the discussion, I think we're at a really interesting but also contradictory time currently where Europe and Japan are promoting hydrogen. The US finally has rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement. Just this Monday, I think Elon Musk hosted a carbon offset price or launched like a carbon capture price. But at the same time, and everyone seems to be aware that we have to do something about climate change, but at the same time, if you look at global emissions, they keep on rising, temperatures keep on climbing. So it'd be really interesting to see with our panelists what startups can do in that space and how we can use startups' ingenuity, innovativeness to tackle this problem. And before we get started on the actual discussion, I'd like to ask the panelists to briefly introduce themselves and share a little bit about their story of how they got to the startup and why they chose to work with that mission that they currently have. And maybe we could start with Anna.
Sure, happy to start. Yeah, so my name is Alex. I'm the founder of Planetly. Planetly, as said, is already my second company. While I was still at my old company at Outfittery, I was pledging very early in an initiative called Leaders for Climate Action. And I pledged to know my own personal footprint and the footprint of my company. So I tried to find out what the footprint of my company was and found that it's not really easy for businesses to understand their carbon footprint. So there was pretty soon a consultant with an Excel sheet running around my company, asking a lot of questions. And in the end, then handed over a PDF report, which was now then supposed to be my carbon footprint. It was in no way actionable. It was in no way manageable. It was all only backward looking. So I, as a leader of the company, had no possibility to do something about it. And I felt like this isn't right. And if the carbon footprint is most important KPI of humanity of the century, we should use better technology in order to track it. And this is exactly now what we're doing at Planetly, to make it really easy for businesses to understand their carbon footprint and make it actionable and make it manageable for them. And so to a certain extent, I guess I'm building a software and a tool which I myself would have liked to have 3 years ago at my other company. Yeah, and we are now, we're based in Berlin. We're now 40 people. Half is tech guys building out the software. The other half is sustainability experts. We worked already with 30 pilot customers, among them like quite some big ones, HelloFresh, Home24, and it's super exciting and super exciting space to be in. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion here.
Yeah, cool. I think we might have a chance later to talk about the leaders for climate action in some more detail. Ferry, do you want to talk a bit about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I'm know Anna actually already quite a while. I think it was 2009, late 2009 when we met at Zalando, and basically in the digital space since almost 12 years now. Currently, I need to correct that a little bit. I did co-found Forto, and I was also CEO, but only until last summer. And I actually moved to the chairman of the board role in order to focus my time now on combating climate change. But to go one step back, so after we sold Daily Deal for the second time, I co-founded Forto, which is a digital freight forwarding business in the logistics space. Obviously, you know, from the first perspective, not solving a climate issue, but actually being part of it in the beginning, because logistics is a huge emitting sector. But at the same time, you can of course also use that asset and being in that space to transform it towards more emission efficient ways of transporting goods. But in essence, for me, my climate journey started in 2015, very slowly, basically on the personal level, where I started to change my nutrition, change my electricity provider, implemented some LED, put solar on the roof, sunsetted my combustion engine car, and so on. And that was kind of the first step for me in 2015. And then the second step was applying these thoughts and these ideas to Forto. Even though we were not in the sustainability space, we measured our footprint from the beginning on, and I can only underline what Anna said. It's pretty painful, and with a huge lack of time that you only get the data and get the results, and it's difficult to really you know, create solid actions from the data that you receive from the traditional providers. But we did that anyways, reduced whatever we could, and also compensated the rest. So turned ourselves climate neutral from foundation on in 2016. And the third kind of level for me was then the co-founding Leaders for Climate Action in 2019, which by now really developed into a great community of entrepreneurs, more than 1,000 already in 23 countries, with a total of more than 130,000 employees in all the organizations combined, and roughly 350,000 tons of CO2 that have already been saved through the community and through the initiative, which is really great, I think. And all of that, you know, led to an ever increasing, or the passion for climate action was ever increasing within me. And it came to that point that at some point, if I had 10 minutes of free time, I was thinking about climate tech and sustainability, and I wasn't thinking about logistics anymore. And I came to the conclusion that, hey, if this is the case, I am by definition not the best CEO anymore for the company. Even though I started it, I put a lot of into it, and I also really love the team, love the culture that we built, and we've been very successful and are still very successful. But I moved out of the kind of, yeah, the daily startup rat race and the thing I've been doing, stepped aside into the board. Because for me, it became very clear that climate change is by far the biggest challenge and problem that we're facing, and I want to dedicate all my time. Since then, I now wrote a book, actually a climate action guide for entrepreneurs, which I just handed in last week, which will be published in April, and am right now starting to again kind of move back into the startup scene through investing, doing angel investments in the climate tech and also adjacent impact areas at the moment. And I'm also looking forward to the discussion here.
Cool. Yeah, great. Interesting evolution there with respect to sustainability. Yeah, Daniel, from moving logistics from across the globe to maybe going into space, how did you get to that point?
Yeah, so I'm Daniel Metzler, one of the co-founders and CEO of ISAR. We started about 3 years ago, pretty much, as a spin-off from Technical University of Munich, where we're already doing a lot of rocket science per se, and it's one of the industries that's scheduled or forecasted to grow the most over the course of the next decade. We thought, hey, why is no one kind of tackling the entire sustainability topic in space, which is actually quite crucial on two levels. The first one being rockets fly through all of the higher atmosphere layers, and particles and emissions you actually put out in the higher atmosphere layers have many-fold bigger impact on the actual Earth climate than just if you have or would drive an internal combustion engine car on the ground. And on the other side, for example, more than 50% of all of the parameters where, for example, OECD is calculating and evaluating climate change is actually based on satellite data. So when Anna before already said we need a lot more better data and use the technology to actually see, hey, how can we even tackle climate change? It also means we need a very solid base for the actual data aggregation. Only then we can actually take actions. So it was also for us very important to essentially have a low-cost access to space, such that we could actually get better and new also commercial satellites into orbit, which then again drive everyone on the world, on Earth, to live a better life with just way more insights into how actually the entire globe climate is developing over the few years.
Yeah, cool. What I hear sort of from the three of you is this idea of like there's this massive problem, but why isn't anyone doing anything about it, right? So just as I started to get into the discussion, first thing I'd like to kind of disentangle with you is this dichotomy between startups and corporates. We have on the one hand, just as a fact for you and the listeners, 100 companies in the world are responsible for 71% of the global emissions since 1998. And then at the same time, like the problem is pressing and no one is doing anything about it. What do you think is the value that startups can offer, and why do you think startups have to come to the forefront and it's not being driven from within the companies? And anyone?
Maybe I pick this. I do think the beauty about startups is that we start building on a green field. There's no existing business model, no existing team, company structures, and so on that we need to like somehow like rebuild. But we can really build from scratch. We can really think about the business models from scratch, and as well how we define the business models in a way that it is not just like balancing earning money and somehow doing good, but really combining and putting both really together. I'm always calling this for purpose, for profit. I think there are multiple names for that. But I do absolutely believe, so we at Planetly, we see ourselves as a for purpose, for profit company. For us, the flywheel is really the bigger we get, the more companies we enable to know their carbon footprint and to be able to reduce it. And the more companies are doing that, the more we earn. So it is really like directly connected already within the business model. And I do believe there is a whole huge like new generation of startups doing exactly that. And they will become very big throughout the next years and decades.
And I think, I mean, a lot of the corporates, or in general, one can say that big parts of the economy are still not working in favor of climate, but they're still profitable and everything. And why is that? I mean, in the end, the economy that we've built is based on fossil fuels still today to a great extent. And it's not a free market. It's totally skewed, because globally, there are roughly 5,500 billion. So that means $5.5 trillion in subsidies every year that go into fossil fuels directly or indirectly. And therefore, those companies that are not taking other aspects into account, like planet and also people, or you can combine it under the wording of purpose, can still operate in a profitable manner. And but I also think that we are right now on the edge of moving kind of into a new age. Yeah, more and more people really understand that the typical way of doing things and that the typical financial capitalism that we have been pursuing over the last, even centuries, one can say, is somehow coming to an end, and the liabilities that we are creating with this system outweigh the benefits. Yeah, and I think especially the younger generation is understanding that and understood that, and therefore we also have a much stronger willingness to act accordingly. And but I have to say, also in the corporate world, I mean, things are moving. They're obviously moving much slower, but some of the, let's say, progressive companies are also trying to do things. But as Anna said in the beginning, if you engineer on the green field, you can set it up from the beginning in a winning design, and the combination of purpose and profit is obviously the best thing. The more profitable, the bigger, the better the company, the more positive side effect for the planet. That's kind of the best case you can have.
Yeah, I think as well, as a startup, I mean, you're usually also either challenging other existing companies on their products or bringing completely new products on the market. And sometimes even, I mean, Christian, the number of 100 companies being responsible for almost 3/4 of all of the emissions, it's quite a big number. But when you then take a look at, I mean, you can't change those 100 companies in a day, but you can actually challenge them as a startup and kind of start taking the market share away from them until they actually have at some point to move in a direction. I think one of the best examples is Tesla, whereas 15 years ago, no one took them seriously. And the goal was really not just to only change a market and bring a big product, good product on the market, but it's really to kind of bring the people to rethink their strategy, to rethink how they actually, or how their actions have an impact on the climate change and or overall Earth's climate. And I think as a startup, you can just do whatever you want to do. You can develop whichever products you want to do. And the good thing here is you don't have to carry that backpack. And the same story we actually had at ESAR when we were deciding on the propellants we would choose actually to go on our rocket. And yes, we could have just kind of taken the easy road and say, hey, let's take just kerosene as the rockets over the past 50 years did. But on the other side, we also had a way more eco-friendly solution in extremely light hydrocarbons, which was just way better suited and producing way less emissions than the kerosene alternative. And thereby we just said, hey, what is the reason for going for kerosene if we can have the exact same performance at probably even the same cost, but then go for less emissions? And so for us, it was a very active decision to go down that road, especially since I guess in the next few years, the awareness for the entire climate topic is just going to grow and grow.
Yeah, I'd like to, those are excellent points. I'd like to plant a flag for the policy and the culture points. I think we'll get to that later. But what I hear is sort of this idea of we don't have any legacy systems, any legacy culture, infrastructure, none of this exists. So that's why a startup can be very successful. And then at the same time, there seems to be this tension between, is it going to be a Tesla story or are we going to merge with them ultimately? Where do you think the sort of the ecosystem is headed? Will it be that slowly but surely what currently are startups will outgrow and overtake the incumbents? Or will they merge and sort of adopt the same viewpoint? Where do you think we're headed?
I think there's a very, very different road probably in store for every single company. For some, it just might make sense to actually get acquired and bring their tech to a big corporate maybe. For others, it might just be the best solution to IPO. All the hype around the SPACs lately, it's, for example, what we've seen as well in the space industry. So I think in general, there's not a right or wrong in terms of how to move as a startup. But I think it's definitely an active choice to say, where does my product, where does my company at some point have the biggest impact on? And that is something that founders can very actively choose and drive.
Yeah. And so from my perspective, I think it also really depends on the incumbents. I think the case of a Tesla is rather rare, that one company really manages to push all the incumbents away and be worth more than all of the German car industry within a couple of years. So I think that the startups in the end play a very important role. and they can also trigger and tease the corporates. Yeah. So, for example, at Forto, and there's also another point I wanted to add. We unfortunately do not have this perfect flywheel that the bigger we get, the more positive impact we create automatically. Yeah, not automatically. So it's not built into the system, but we are pushing, like we're doing whatever we can within our setting. We're, for example, creating a transparency for our business customers that move containers and pallets from A to B, because today most of them don't even know how much it actually emits to move a 40-foot container from Shanghai to Munich. So we're creating transparency, giving them the opportunity to compensate their emissions that they create. And that actually also triggered some action in our industry. And other large incumbents also started doing that and started, for example, compensating less than container load shipments that they're doing for their customers. So I think startups have multiple roles, and it is certainly also good to to keep the incumbents on their heels and push them a bit more towards innovation. Yeah.
Maybe one thing to add here, what helps me always a lot is clarity that impact is the equation of purpose and scale, right? So you can have like the best purpose of the world. If you cannot scale it, you will not have any impact. And at the same time, if you have a huge scale but no like purpose, that's not what I would call impact. So at some point, a startup might consider to join some other company, which would increase the scale, and by this, then the impact, as long as the purpose stays the same and stays what the startup is there for, right? And is not like transformed and just like swallowed by the big corporate. So this is definitely a legitimate way to go at some point, I guess.
What I think where we don't get around, and also because we already get the first Q&A questions around it, and it seems to sort of incentive align incumbents with the purpose that you have in mind. So maybe we skip to the first policy issue there. How do you think? Well, it's a touchy subject. We had it in the discussion before the live stream started. So talking carbon offsets, I know Forto with Ferry, you use it to offset the things you can't reduce, and then Anna, same for you. How do you view that? Is that sort of the be all end all? How far should we push those carbon offsets to get initial traction within an industry, and what should the long-term goal be policy-wise to transition the entire economy?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, the beauty about carbon offsets is that you can do it directly and immediately, and you can as well do it backward looking. So I can look at my emissions from the past and can say, I'm taking responsibility and offset what is already lies in the past. But what we tell our clients, and our clients are really, very eager to do, is to understand it's not about like just offsetting what you do and then doing business as usual, but it is extremely important to now, from here on, in this point in time, looking forward, to reduce your emissions. And this is exactly what we do see with our clients using Planetly, what they are really eager to do. So they actively want to manage their emissions. They actively want to see if the emissions increase, for example. They actively want to see these data and use these data whenever they're doing like purchasing decisions or other decisions. So they really, and this is what we are trying to provide them with the infrastructure for, to make carbon one of the KPIs that the businesses are steered on. So not just the financial KPIs, but I sincerely do believe that we need to take on these sustainability KPIs from here going forward, and that in the future they will be as important as financial KPIs. And for a CEO of a company, it will be completely neutral to not only talk about the revenue, but to talk about as well the footprint and how they've reduced the footprint over the last years. So to achieve this, we first need to measure. We cannot manage what we can't measure, and I think this is the very important step here that we need to take first, and then offsetting a little bit can be a good first step, but definitely not the last step, and the reduction must be in the focus.
Another point I want to add here is that I think it's also really important to differentiate between offsets that are kind of avoiding a potential carbon and methods and projects that are actually really removing carbon out of the air. Because those are two different things, and I think we should and need also to focus much more on the removal part instead of the avoiding part, in essence, because if you just avoid it, it effectively doesn't pull the carbon, like it doesn't, you emit a ton and you avoid it somewhere else. Okay, that means you don't have 2, but you still have 1 ton out there. Yeah. So I think the removal part is important within the compensation, and obviously there is a big variance of quality within carbon offsets. You can partially even buy them for 80 cents. Those are usually not the right ones. And at the same time, like I agree with Anna that it's something we have to do right now. It's also a market that we have to develop, because all those gloomy and nice goals that all the companies are putting out, being climate neutral by 2030, by whenever, this is heavily based on compensation, and they would never make it if compensation wouldn't exist. But the compensation market at the moment is much too small to like there's not enough supply for all the demand that will be created. So it's something that we have to develop heavily, but it needs to be done in the right way.
Fully agree here. I mean, as a rocket company, that is actually a tricky one, because there's literally no physical way you can get a satellite into Earth orbit without setting out any emissions. It's just not possible based on Newton's laws. So in that case, it's really more about making sure that you actually, on another side, actually take them actively out and not just offsetting them. So anything that really goes towards making sure you draw CO2 out of the atmosphere, that is, I see where it has to go in the future, because there's just a few things that you, or in terms of emissions, that you just can't avoid. So in that case, as a rocket company, I guess we're a bit special here, definitely. On another level, it might definitely be a thing. So all of our engineering, all of our standard business operations, obviously they fall all under that. So it's literally only the actual launch part. But it's something where we'll have to look in technology-wise, I guess, in the next years, and rather sooner than later, on how we can actually reduce the total amount and not just offset it purely.
No, it's great coming to this issue of, we know that like it seems a bit like it's sort of the first best thing, or like a good thing we can do right now. It's like culture building for the companies we work with, and like it has to be done. But it sounds like most of you would agree that it's not the final solution. How do you think we can move from here to either carbon offsetting regime, or let's say a global emission trade, and maybe, because that seems like a pretty large gap, sort of what is you think a good first step that either on a national level in Germany, or on a European level, or maybe even an international level, should be taken to move from this voluntary carbon offset space to a more stringent carbon tax, or what have you?
Yeah, I mean, you just mentioned it. Basically, implementing a carbon tax can be a very effective tool. I mean, in Germany, we now do have a carbon tax as of January 1st, but unfortunately with a very low price of 25 euros, which will not move the needle and not have, it won't have a steering impact on the emissions. Yeah. So such a price is a great tool. And I think it's great that we have it, but it needs to be much more expensive, so that it will actually lead to the point where businesses change their models and really do it for commercial reasons, because it's not feasible anymore in the old way.
Yeah, I do agree. I'm not fully convinced of the concept of carbon tax, though I would prefer to actually have a carbon certificate market, which would, to a certain extent, as well be then like putting a price on the carbon, but then the amount of certificates in the market can be reduced every year, and by this you naturally come to a higher price that companies who are emitting a lot need to pay, and other companies that are not emitting that much can really profit from that. So, for example, Tesla, we talked about it now multiple times. They are earning a lot of money with selling their certificates that they don't need and that they don't use. So I'm leaning a little bit towards that versus the carbon tax, because I think it will trigger more behavioral shift within the companies. But anyhow, I think the most important thing is to create a budget line for such budgets first, right? So currently companies are using our planet and are exploiting our planet, and they don't pay anything for that, right? And the first thing now is we need to get it into the financial budgets. They need to pay something for that. And I absolutely agree, like with 25 euro per ton, this is not really a lot, and this is not really shaping and changing behavior. But from here, then we have a point that we can increase this, and we need to increase it to make reduction projects even more attractive as well from a financial standpoint.
I'm also always a fan of business models which don't punish people if they don't do something, but if they reward if they actually do something actively. So I think also in the general awareness topic, that's something I'm very curious if any one of the listeners can come up with a super smart idea on how to actually reward people who actively do something against it in their own businesses, maybe, rather than just having a law in place that says, hey, if you output X amount of CO2, you'll have to pay Y amount of money. And that just, I think, drastically already changes how people even think about it. They don't say, oh, I don't want to pay any fines, but it's actually, hey, if I do something very actively from my own point of view, I might just get a good reward from it, which I can maybe somehow use in another area of business. So I'm super curious if there's anyone in the participants to come up with a super smart business solution on all of that.
Is there? Let me put maybe while the audience is thinking about the super smart solutions to their question, I'll give them a little breather and put you on the spot though. What is within the companies either that you're working with or ESA Aerospace itself? What is sort of the level that you currently see in the carbon price? Like, do you pay anything? Do you have it as a budget line? And then say for Forto and Planetly, what is sort of a range that you're paying? If you say 25 is too low, and then maybe direct air capture is going to be $600, that's probably too high. Where are we currently at, and how would you, maybe as a second point for own security policy-wise, how would you like to see that evolve? How fast and how long term?
So our rockets are not yet actively launching. We're finalizing development this year. So this year, I guess, on all of the levels, we're still in a fairly acceptable range. We'll have to see really where we'll go next year. I mean, overall, if you compare it to industry-wise, for example, the entire space industry is something in the range of about less than 1% of the global aviation industry, at least pre-COVID. So it's compared again to a quite large industry, fairly small. On the other side, it's definitely something, as both Anna and Ferry said, you need to be aware in the first place. You need to have something that you can measure on what you actually output, and only then you can start working and acting on it. I'd say that especially starting next year, when our values are actually going up just due to our operations, due to rockets launching, it'll be a bit more tricky. So we'll actually have to see on how we could do the best we possibly can for a company where it's just intrinsically it's not possible to not emit any emissions at all.
Anna, what do you think about such an answer? Does that satisfy the it's on the budget line criteria?
So I took away it's not yet on your budget line. Interestingly, one of our very first customers was from the space industry. It was another space startup, Yuri, they are called, and they are sending.
I know them, yeah.
Yeah, I thought so. They're sending experiments into space with SpaceX, and we offsetted their share on the SpaceX rocket. So that was one of the very first clients. I'm a little bit familiar with that, and as well with all the effects that Daniel described, like with the higher it gets, the worse it is for the atmosphere, radiative forcing it is called. But my point on that, so I don't think that there is just one answer on this question. There is not this one price which is right for every industry, because actually the prices need to vary on different levels of prices need to be until different industries really move and invest into reduction projects. And this is as well the biggest counter argument to the certificate market that I just described versus the tax, that you cannot vary the prices per ton per industry that easily. And one tool for a company to deal with that already now, before they need to pay this price, is the concept of internal carbon pricing. So in this concept, you as a company, you just set yourself a price per ton of carbon that you emit. And it's more kind of a virtual concept, but then it is kind of in the budget line, and this budget can then get shifted around and can be removed. So you will probably then see that, for example, the logistics department has quite a high budget because they're emitting quite a lot. So this should be where we focus on first. How can we reduce that? What can we do there in future? And so on and so forth. And this is helping companies to actually initiate the right reduction projects if you then compare the internal carbon price versus the costs for reduction projects.
Before you get to Ferry, who seems eager to say something on this, can you quantify though both of those? What is the range you typically see on internal carbon pricing, and then to the extent you're allowed to speak about it on the offsetting side, what do you typically see as an average?
Yeah,
say dollar per ton value.
So on the internal carbon prices, this varies. I think this is, I think Volkswagen, for example, who worked with such internal carbon pricing, there the internal carbon price was something around, I think it's 60 euro per ton in the beginning to start with. I'm not exactly sure where they are now and if they've already increased it after they introduced it. In general, what do we see as prices for carbon offsets? As Harry said, that varies. You can find some offsets for euro. This is nothing that we would offer at Planetly, and it can go up to a few hundred euros per ton, for example. One of the most kind of exciting technologies on the carbon removal side is Climeworks, a company from Zurich, and they are taking with huge turbines are taking the carbon out of the atmosphere. But currently taking 1 ton of carbon out of the atmosphere costs around 600 euro. So it is not scalable currently because it will not be paid by a big amount of companies. So I think on average, you can say anything above between 10 and 25 euro per ton probably is one of the higher quality projects that you can support today.
Okay. Ferry, your thoughts?
Yeah, not that much to add. At Forto, we are working with something between 10-15 euros. We are also offering it to our customers, and at the moment we're even for the customers that say, hey, okay, I will go ahead and compensate, we even double the amount of CO2 that, so if they compensate 1 ton, we add another ton to incentivize that to some extent out of our own pocket. And I mean, typical pricing, at least in Germany, I'm not that familiar, in the UK, for consumers is around 20, 23 tons or so. It also again depends on the project. Some companies are combining the CO2 effect, also with additional positive social effects for a community or for health of the community and so on. And then prices vary. Yeah. Obviously, the carbon removal is still with Climeworks at least super or very expensive. Yeah. So something that helps there also to create a certain cost degression in those more expensive projects. If you have a bigger volume as a company, to buy a certain portfolio, to say not I offset whatever my 10,000 tons only with forest or with project X, but say, hey, I do 80 or 90% maybe with normal priced, and then I allocate 5-10% into the expensive project, so that they can also start develop and come down with a cost curve.
Maybe one thing to add for the audience, if you're interested, I mean, I don't want to go too deep into the offsetting subject, but there are huge changes to be expected within this year. Which projects can be verified and certified in the future, and which not. And this is due to the Kyoto Protocol running out and the Paris Agreement actually coming into place when it comes to that. And for example, renewable energy projects, which are the source of these super cheap carbon offset certificates currently in the market, will not be certifiable anymore in the future.
Interesting. I didn't know that. Also, great point on the portfolio, sort of selectively choosing some startups that might be too expensive, but you still support them. Yeah, I think before we get too stuck on just the carbon emissions and exactly that policy issue, as some of the audience members asked, that we also tackle some other issues. Let's go to policy, culture more broadly, particularly the point that we mentioned at the beginning, leaders for climate action. How do you view this, like your role? Maybe we start with Ferry, who founded the NGO. How do you view your role, and how do you get this dichotomy between what Anna mentioned as for profit, for purpose? How do you get that right, and how does it also extend beyond just carbon and caring about, say, unilaterally one metric?
So in the end, I mean, we're, as you mentioned, non-profit organization, and we see ourselves as an entrepreneurial community. Yeah. So we are not actively changing the business models of some of our members, be it Zalando or Delivery Hero or Get Your Guide. Yeah, we're not in that position, by far not. Yeah, but what we do is that we kind of created a place where people that are willing to act can come together. We created quite some knowledge that we're sharing. So we're basically facilitating climate action for startups and also other companies that usually have other priorities. Yeah, and what I experienced also, especially a couple of years ago, when climate action wasn't mainstream. Yeah, I mean, by now it is becoming mainstream, and Greta helped a lot, and it's very good. Yeah, it's very good that it is becoming mainstream, because it has to become mainstream. But in the earlier days, whenever I was talking on an intellectual level with the people about the climate crisis and that we need to do something, there was a lot of consensus. Yeah, but then in the actual world and the actual execution was missing. So people had the same thoughts, but in the end, you got stuck into the day-to-day business, and it never made it on the priority list. Yeah, and it wasn't happening. And that is kind of, we wanted to push people over the line and push them into action, trigger the kind of the climate action journey for them, no matter what their business is. Yeah, and that worked pretty well. Obviously, companies and also different CEOs are on different levels. Some are very early and do it a bit. Others are very passionate about it and are fully aligned and really love it. But in the end, we need everyone. Yeah, and even if a company, especially with a bigger size, only improves 5 or 10%, that's already great. Yeah, and I think it is also a journey that takes time, and a lot of people, start small, do a couple of steps, get used to it, extend your knowledge, extend the action, and do more and more over time. Yeah, so in essence, one can say we're building a community We're facilitating climate action. We're reducing the transaction costs basically to do that. And we also hold our members accountable because they report their footprints to us. They report what kind of actions they've been doing. They report the compensation to us. So we're also an accountability partner. That's all on the action side of things. And that happens on the one hand side with the CEO personally of the organization. Yeah. So we ask them to measure their personal footprint and also to reduce that with a couple of guidelines that we give. And at the same time on the company level. And then the second side of the whole initiative is a political one. And that is, it's more difficult. It's not as direct. We don't have as much influence, but by now it is a pretty sizable community, at least in Germany and in Europe. And we're sending a signal for effective climate legislation towards the politicians. Yeah, unfortunately, you never really know what the effect is, but we're also using the community for that, and especially for this year, also more and more.
Yeah.
Well, Daniel, sorry, go ahead.
I think you can do it both internally within every company and then externally in terms of which values do you transfer. One of the things we're very eager on is, for example, the entire space debris, keeping space clean. And some might just think, well, what do I care about space debris? But at the end of the day, it's the exact same thing as a plastic bottle in the ocean. There's just a piece of junk flying around that might just as well, I don't know, hit the GPS satellite so you can't use Google Maps anymore, or hit your TV satellite so you can't watch TV anymore. So it's exactly the same amount of junk that we would have on Earth. On the other side, it also has an effect on the actual climate with all of the radiation actually that's being shielded from that space debris part. So that's one of the topics we're very, very actively going towards, especially again there, since the past 50 years, companies and governments did not care at all. They just put up stuff in space and they never cared on what's going to happen. There's rocket stages up there since 50 years and will probably stay there for quite a bit of time unless someone actually takes action. And that's also one of the parts where actually policy will have to happen, same as with I see in other few industries, just in order to create some sense of urgency. But again, here I see one of the big drivers is going to be what is the reward that you can actually get for being active on it, so that you don't always see it as a punishment, but also as a positive thing. And yeah, obviously on the other side, everything that you can do internally in terms of educating every employee within the company, that's always a good topic. And I think there it actually has to start to just make everyone aware who may not yet be aware of the entire climate change topics and of the KPIs we actually use.
Anna, what is Ferry's vision? Was that the reason why you joined? On LinkedIn, funnily enough, I think it said animal welfare as a category for leaders for climate change. So,
really?
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, the Leaders for Climate Change initiative at least brought me to becoming a climate tech entrepreneur, and now trying to rethink the whole topic around sustainability KPIs. So yeah, I'm giving like kind of committing my everyday job and life towards this topic, and it absolutely feels great. But to be honest, I forgot the initial question that you asked.
Yeah, but well, the initial question was how do you integrate this for purpose versus for profit in your startup as well, and say your personal life.
So I do really believe there are a lot of like many business models out there which do, as I said, like not just balance purpose and profit, but really combine these two. And I think it might be that you need to think like a little harder, but I'm absolutely sure that there are many more business models out there. And that is, as I said, like the beauty of startups. You can really rethink this and think this from scratch. And how can you? So the question that you need to answer for yourself is: the bigger my company gets, why does the purpose increase? And if you have an answer to that, I think then you found a great business model, which is a for-purpose, for-profit business model.
That's a great answer. Let me
One small thing I wanted to add,
sorry.
Christian, just because you also asked, okay, are you solely focusing on carbon, etc.? Yeah, and indeed, our like very clear focus is really climate, and climate from a carbon standpoint. Yeah, one can of course also think towards education, etc., etc. But we also do have a VC sustainability clause that we are using with the venture capital firms, and that clause, for example, is a bit more holistic. So it basically urges the companies, or actually commits the portfolio companies of the VCs to develop an ESG policy for their company as one part, and that obviously makes them think about it, and at the same part implement the guidelines and kind of the rules that we created with Leaders for Climate Action, without necessarily becoming a member of Leaders for Climate Action. I really don't care about that, to be honest. I care about the fact that people take the action and do the right thing there.
Yeah, that's exactly, that would have been sort of my final question before I guess we head into a Q&A. Is we're all in the lucky position where we've kind of on this climate sustainability bandwagon, but not everyone is. And sort of the question is like, you were speaking about changing your diet. I turned vegetarian a couple of years ago, and then my girlfriend was mainly worried that I'd be one of those people who every dinner like remind people that it's bad to eat meat. So the question is, if you have a certain mission, and I guess most of us would agree that it's one of the most important missions that we have as civilization currently, what is the right level of communicating? It's like, how often do you want to beat that drum, and how do you engage people? Like, so far, maybe in the first years, you get people into your companies who are already on board, but how do you approach the naysayers or people who are not really eager to join or to do anything about sustainability?
So as Planetly, this was one of the things we put a lot of thinking into from the very beginning, because it was very important to me to avoid the how do you say it in English, like the erhobene Zeigefinger. So to avoid always say like, oh, you've done bad in the past, you should care, you should behave differently, and so on and so forth. So because in the moment that you do this, you're kind of leveraging yourself basically above the person you're talking to. So to a certain extent, you pretend I'm better, I'm not doing this, you are doing bad. And I do believe in that moment, you lose a lot of people. You just don't get through to them anymore. That's why, as Planetly, we defined for ourselves that we're not doing this, that we're not judging what has been in the past, that we're always looking forward. So if a company wants to act from here on forward, we are there to help. And we're very positively communicating on all the momentum and all the progress that has already been made, not sharing too many disaster and the world will go down scenarios, really communicating on all the pioneers, all the movement and the momentum that is really building up in that. And that's why once per week, I'm sharing the Planetly positive news on LinkedIn. So you can follow me there, and really picking what happened positively on this topic throughout the week, and not sharing too many negative news around that topic.
Daniel or Ferry, any opinion on how to approach?
I think
aren't fully convinced.
Yeah, I think you need to make sure, or everyone needs to make sure that it's not a message that essentially lands in the spam folder. So if you keep reminding people every 2 hours, basically, it's just something they will just say, hey, please keep that away from me, I don't care. But it has, I think, to just have it has to be content-wise, I think. I think people truly need to understand what's actually in it, rather than just people thinking they are doing something good without actually knowing what is behind. And so in the entire communications topic, I think content-wise, it's extremely important to just make everyone aware, and that I see is just happening a lot through facts-based communications. So if you can share, I don't know, I think about 70% of the global landmass is now used for livestock, for example, for livestock sectors. I mean, those numbers are just extremely big, and you just need to make sure that people understand also what is the effect of eating meat every single day, or what is the effect of eating meat every second or third day, and maybe how would the Earth climate actually look differently if you wouldn't do so. And just with that, to give some sort of examples where people can easily understand, so kind of easy to digest information, but really has an important content with it to actually try people make really truly understand what goes all along down the supply chain, for example.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, obviously, or luckily, there aren't that many naysayers anymore. At least not in Germany. I guess it's a different situation still in the US.
Yeah.
But I think like the general science around climate change is pretty much accepted. But of course, there are some people, you know, the question is, how critical is it? How urgent is it? How fast do we have to act, and how radical do we need to act? Yeah, and that's again also a dangerous line where some people, you know, that are saying yes, it exists, but you know, let's not do something that might harm our economy, etc. And in the end, you can also only work with facts and with science kind of against that. I think, yeah. So fact-based argumentation is, I think, a good way on the one hand side. On the other side, you also need to take into consideration a certain psychological part. And there's a page, unfortunately, it's in German. It's called klimafakten.de, and they even approached climate communication with psychologists and really put down, okay, what are reasons why people, you know, don't believe it or don't want to act, and so on, and what is actually behind that, and how you can argue with that and or against that, and ultimately basically convince and win people to start thinking into the right direction. That on a high level. On a low level and kind of day-to-day basis, I think it's important to bring the sustainability question close to the decision making and also the purchasing decisions. Everyone is making quite a lot of purchasing decisions, and in the end, with the money that you spend, you decide if it's going to be allocated towards sustainable things and products or not. Yeah, and so bringing more transparency into that, for example, with the idea of also adding the carbon footprint of to all kind of nutrition that we're taking. Yeah, similar to the calories and the fat and the sugar. Also know, okay, hey, this stuff was imported from Fiji, and the liter of water that you're drinking emits the 3 kilograms of emissions or whatever it is. Yeah, those just as a couple of thoughts.
I would like to add two things to that, because I do believe there's really a lot that each and every one of us can do. And maybe I want to add two things to, like, the normal ones: turning vegan, not eating meat, and so on and so forth. So the highest motivation for our clients to become carbon neutral is to strengthen their employer brand. And this for me came as a surprise, because I rather thought, it's about strengthening their consumer brand and so on and so forth. But the priority number one is strengthening their employer brand. Especially in this war of talent, attracting the best people, and so on and so forth. And as I'm sure there are a lot of people, like highly educated people listening right now, really make sure whenever you apply at a company to ask this company about their climate action that they are taking. Ask the company if they are already measuring their footprint. Ask the company if they offset it, if they are already carbon neutral. And this is really, you do really have a lever there which you can pull. as a young person. And so the message is it is heard by the companies. The other day, a client told me exactly this. So there was an applicant sitting, and then he asked me if we are carbon neutral, and I didn't have an answer to that. Now I want to change this. That's why I'm now working with Planetly, right? So you really have a strong lever there. This first, and then second, in Germany, we are in the year of elections. These elections are extremely important regarding the climate crisis, because we don't have more than 10 years to be able to act. So the next 10 years will decide if we are able to turn this around or no. And we're electing and voting for the next 4 years. So this is an extremely important election. So make sure to really talk about this with your friends, with your family. I think you can have a big impact on that side as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good closing statement for the panel. I'd like to thank all three of you before we head into the Q&A. Yeah, from the audience, I hope you had a good listen to this. The measurability, actionability of climate change, how to do culture building in the company, how to approach companies that currently aren't yet doing what you would optimally like them to do. Get CO2 onto your budget, at least as a list item for now, and then also just use your own career as sort of a voting with your employees and with the companies. So yeah, from now on, I think we'll be tackling the questions. You can just put them in the chat. We already have a bunch, and then feel free to upvote them so we see where there's most interest. Depending on time, some of the panelists might leave a bit earlier, so we'll just try to tackle that. I think some of the questions we already covered, but one question that came up was again on this topic of CO2 emissions being the single KPI. It's originally directed at Anna, but the other people can maybe also speak to it. How do you, is there a way to take a more holistic approach in measuring business impact on the environment, including biodiversity and even environmental justice? What are your thoughts? Is that a communicatable idea, or is the single KPI approach better?
So we're working strictly regarding the GHG protocol standard, which is the accounting standard for carbon emissions. And this standard is not only taking into account carbon, but as well 6 other greenhouse gases. And they are all recalculated as carbon equivalents. So to just have one number and make it easy for businesses and people to understand that. So this is already including other gases, like methane and some others. So this first, and second, yes, I would like, and this could as well be for us be one possibility going forward, to include other environmental KPIs. And for now, we are very focused on carbon equivalents, because we believe this is the best, there is the best measurability currently, and this measurability is important to really encourage massive action and action on scale throughout the next years. So, and for example, as well, if you look at the ESG criteria, which are great, but if you're honest, actually only the carbon equivalents are really the measurable part in that. All the rest is quite hard to measure. It's rather a checkbox. Or rather, like, I have implemented that policy, I'm focusing on that, I'm looking at diversity and things like that. So, and I do believe in order to really transform our business world, we need to, and we're doing good in focusing on the most measurable stuff first.
I think actually in the next few years, there's going to be a few assets in space again to measure that. So we're actually, satellites will be able to tell you the exact composition of different atmosphere layers even. Then you can actually start pinpointing it and say, hey, this specific factory is outputting this amount of CO2. And I think that already in itself is a big game changer, because then you don't really rely on everyone. I mean, you don't see when you stand in front of the building whether the power there or electricity they're consuming is actually coming from green energy or not. But when you actually also overall just take a look at specific buildings, specific cities, even entire countries, you could actually start building that entire fact-based database, and from there onwards take action.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question that is semi-related, but it goes closer to Ferry's comment on VC sustainability. Is from Robert. What do you think needs to change from an investment standpoint, VCs and PEs, to nurture and support growing companies to become climate neutral? Are strict investment policies the way to go? What are other options?
Yeah, so what we see, or what I also see in the VC landscape, is that there are more and more funds and more money that has the goal to be deployed in within the impact space. Yeah. So in other words, at the moment, it's still the small part of the overall cake. Yeah, very clearly, most VCs and PEs for sure have a very clear mandate, and that mandate is maximize profit. Yeah. But the part of the VCs especially that are also focusing on impact, either as one bucket of what they do. For example, with Early Bird, we do have a climate tech practice. It's not a separate climate tech fund, but it's a climate tech practice that is looking at that part, similar to a fintech or prop tech, etc. Practice within the fund. And there are also even some funds that are being created right now that are really only focusing on impact. And I think this is a mega trend that is starting right now, that is still early, but that will increase exponentially over the next years. And as a startup, if you have mission-aligned investors, it is obviously very helpful. Yeah. And especially in the case that your business model is not perfectly combined with purpose, as it is, for example, for Anna. Yeah, if you have to make decisions that potentially slow down your business a bit, but are in favor of impact, then having the right investors on board is very important. And a clause like the VC clause that we have, of course, that doesn't change the mindset yet of a founder. But I think in the end, I mean, the power of investors is relatively strong, and nudging also startup founders that maybe don't see that yet into that direction is certainly helpful.
And maybe one thing to add from my side, so I do really believe that investors increasingly see something like carbon neutrality in businesses as an indicator for being a good and stable business overall, because it represents and it shows that the people who are at the top of this company are thinking into the future, are seeing the risks that are about to come, are willing to take action. So it is a proxy, it is an indicator for a healthy business overall. And we've seen this now in the COVID crisis, where like funds which are strong on the ESG ratings perform much better than funds that aren't. So I really do believe, and I think this is important as well, that it's not just the intrinsic motivation by the investors, but it is a business case. Climate action became a business case for companies and for investors today. And this makes me optimistic. Yeah.
And just another proof point for what Anna just said. If you look, for example, today at the market cap of ExxonMobil, formerly the most valuable company in the world. I mean, not taking into account today our big digital companies, but formerly 10 years ago, most valuable company in the world. Today, Nextera, kind of the biggest US renewable company, has a bigger market cap than ExxonMobil, and Exxon is only around 140 billion or so, even though being a huge organization, still with lots of profits. But everyone just knows their business model and what they do does not fit together and doesn't work ultimately with the crisis that we're in.
Daniel, did you, in sort of like reaching out to funding, is that something either from you pitching or you selecting VCs that you look for?
So we're fortunate enough to actually have Early Bird as an investor. It's definitely one of the most prominent one to push the entire climate change topic in general. I think, but as well, especially in the past year or two, maybe, we've seen more and more, not just awareness also on investor side, but as well just the actual impact investing in terms of all of the technology that actually goes into carbon removal, for example. Probably about 15 years ago, you couldn't have raised mega rounds on technology that actually helps the climate getting better. I think today more and more of that is actually possible, and it makes me happy because it's a good sign that there's also money being made available for the sake of humanity, essentially to make sure that all of these technologies at some point actually get into a commercial use at some point as well. I think for a VC point of view, I mean, it's not a fun to just give away money where there's no business cases behind the companies, but I think it's a strong point to differentiate some companies from others, definitely.
All right. Yeah, I think given that we're running out of time for some of our panelists, I think this is probably a good time to call it quits. There were some COVID questions, but I think we all talked enough about that topic in the last 12 months, so we don't have to rehash that. Yeah, thanks to the panelists for sharing all the interesting insights. Thank you for the participants for sending in the questions, and I hope everyone learned something today.
Yeah, thanks for the interesting questions, and yeah, to everyone in the audience, make sure to reach out to us, follow up if you have any questions, anything that you're really interested in. Yeah, I guess I'm speaking for all of us. Happy to connect.
Yeah,
on LinkedIn.
Absolutely. Feel free to reach out via LinkedIn, and hope it was a bit inspiring and everyone could take away a few pieces.
Yeah,
thanks,
looking forward to good ideas coming out of all of the minds of the people listening.
Right, your call for business models.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.